when you finally understand what data centricity is. Unlike China, which created the Shanghai Data Exchange back in 2016, too many Europeans and American leaders, particularly in our government, still fail to truly understand the importance of data. To be clear, the country that is going to lead in the adoption of AI and machine learning will lead the world. China gets it. Of course, they've been drastically investing to make this happen for years. We're far, far behind. Now, you suddenly realize the importance of your organization's data. You also know the constraints, both in terms of regulations and compliance, but also in terms of culture, silos, and lack of technology adoption, which prevents you and your team to truly become a data-centric organization. Often data is siloed, not properly tagged or labeled. If you're lucky enough to have a data lake or warehouse, often it is all about collecting all kind of data without truly understanding if they're even valuable. The bigger the better, right? A data-centric architecture treats data as the most valuable asset, but also the most versatile asset instead of an expensive afterthought. Data centricity significantly simplifies the collection, integration, transformation, security, portability, and analysis, while enabling and streamlining the access to insights across the organization's silos to make faster and better decisions. This is the opposite of the former concept of application centricity, which siloed data in dozens of environments and silos, often preventing reuse or simple access. Of course, at the same time, you're being asked to protect the data, make sure that only the right people with the need to know and the right level of access can access the data. And it's a very complex problem now that you have to federate and aggregate data across the enterprise. Data centricity is a foundational pillars for your zero trust architecture and implementation as well. If you missed our segment on zero trust, checking out now. There are a few key concepts to make this happen. First, teams and the organization's culture need to adjust to this new paradigm, and ideally, this entire training course will help you and help your colleagues get there. If not, please let me know. Second, let's take a look at the critical components that need to be mature enough to securely enable this data-centric at scale across your organization and its silos. First, let's look at data critical information to enable data centricity. So there are key informations about your data that you must have to get where you want to go. First, ownership. Who owns the data? How do you delegate policy and labeling decisions? Then integrity. What mechanism is used to protect data integrity? Provenance. Who, how, and when was it integrated? From where? What mechanism is used to ensure data provenance? Labeling. Is the data owner empowered to assign label to his data down to the cell level? And how does the data owner define what user gets access to what label? Are you using policy as code? Is your policy enforcement point capable of runtime decisions like what device is being used, the state of the device, the geolocation, and time of day? Explainability. How did machine and policy enforcement point come to specific data-driven decisions? Can these be explained back to humans so it doesn't look like a black box? Insights. Is the data organized and labeled to maximum the value to your stakeholders? Interoperability. Is your data fabric capable of being agnostic? Integrate edge capabilities? Interoperate with machine and application outside of your organization? All these key answers will define your maturity in getting to a data-centric organization. Now let's talk about additional components in your data centricity journey. The policy enforcement point, PEP, is ideally a reverse proxy that's able to connect to different databases and lakes and warehouse, agnostic to the environment with the same enforcement across stack without tampering with the data flow. The policy decision point with its delegated policies is where the decision, yes, no for access, for example, is made. Teams can use technologies like Open Policy Agent to get this done. The decision is decoupled with the enforcement point so that you have options, but more importantly, so that the decision point is the same across all applications to ensure a cohesive implementation. Your identity management stack must be able to support labelings of users via policy as code and runtime enforcement of these labels based on the policy decision point to decide, based on the device risk, for example, if you're allowed to keep a label you have access to under these security conditions. For example, if you use a different device or a personal device, maybe you don't get access to that label because you're not using a corporate device. Of course, your data fabric is essential and it must enable the policy enforcement point and the policy decision point so they can be implemented across your enterprise and ensure that it enforces not just basic access control, but also limiting the access to data down to the cell level. For example, in the same database, maybe the PI information will be labeled PII and the PHI will be labeled PHI, and non-sensitive data would have maybe no label, and users will only be able to see the right data fields based on their need to know. So let's take a look at how the Department of Defense thought of this issue across the largest organization in the world. In DoD, we have a great example here where we have mission partners across multiple nations with 50 plus networks that are completely siloed with different devices, and yet we have to share data across all these nations, meaning that the US personnel often has dozens of devices on their desks to be able to share data across networks. These networks are classified and air-gapped, so you often have to literally burn DVDs to be able to move data from one network to the next. The idea was to decide to flatten all these networks into one by using data centricity and security to be able to limit who can see what, because of course some nations cannot see other nations' data and what we share with other nations as well. So we need to be able to completely silo using software-defined means the data access so that these nations have no visibility as to what other nations do or don't do. That's where we created the Cloud Native Access Point and the Air Force and Space Force Data Fabric. As you can see here, we have a user on the left, and that based on the data-centric policy engine through continuous authentication, the assessment of the device being used, the identity of the user, we decide who gets access to what under what condition. So we can be very precise in terms of rules, for example, based on time of the day, on the device being used, or if the device is not patched for more than X days, we decide whether or not to allow the user to have access to a specific label to be able to access specific data. Then, of course, we have multiple connectors. We're able to tap into pretty much any cloud and on-premise environment and access not only different Kubernetes stack, but also we have the ability to connect to databases and file folders and applications and resources all the way down to containers and data objects and data lakes. Each of these resources can use labeling and metadata to effectively let us use the policy enforcement point to limit whether a user even gets to see the database at all, or if he gets to see maybe a specific table in the database and even down to the cell level. So if they don't get to see maybe some PII information, for example. So that gives us a lot of flexibility to macro segment the network. So they only get to see what they're supposed to see using the concept of a software-defined perimeter and segment of one. Check out our video on Zero Trust to learn more. There you have it. Data centricity is the foundation to provide your organization with secure and timely access to your data at scale across silos without putting your organization at tremendous cyber risk. This is how the DoD managed to consolidate dozens of networks into one while enforcing proper need to know and least privilege concepts.